Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Belgrade Security Forum, or welcome back to the Belgrade Security Forum, to the panel called Anti-Western Narratives in the Western Balkans, Threat to Euro-Atlantic Integration. So the very title of this panel has not failed to raise some controversies on social media ahead of the panel itself. And it raised controversies both in terms of the formulation of anti-Western narratives, and on the other hand also of the formulation of the phrase of Euro-Atlantic integration. So there's always this question: can we put these two neatly into two camps? Can we speak about anti-Western narratives as something broadly negative to refer to, and can we refer to Euro-Atlantic integration as the positive force? And if so, how the two interact with each other, and how do we deconstruct this, and what are the useful ways to think about these topics and to advance our knowledge on that? So it really is, I think, an almost impossible quest to speak about this wider topic of the anti-Western narratives and of authoritarian influencing in the Western Balkans and also in other countries without raising questions and without raising complaints from both camps. On the one hand, there's always the risk of being accused of being an imperialist, of believing in a liberal world order in which there is a good and there is a bad side of things. On the other hand, there's also the risk of criticism from those who complain about minimizing an issue, who complain about applying a false equivalence to something that are more authoritarian practices coming from certain non-Western countries and practices from the West. So all these are very interesting, but at the same time difficult topics that are very hard to tackle, but at the same time we need to try. And I'm sure that with this distinguished team of panelists that we have here today, we're going to do so in a fruitful and nuanced way. So without further ado, here are the four distinguished panelists that I have the pleasure of introducing today. We have Professor Florian Bieber, who is a professor of Southeast European History and Politics and the director of the Center for East European Studies at the University of Graz in Austria. And he's also the coordinator of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group. Welcome, Florian. We have Asya METODIEVA, who's a junior researcher at the Institute of International warfare, with a focus on the Western Balkans. Then we have Nikola Burazer, who's the program director at the Center for Contemporary Politics, and he's also the executive editor at the European Western Balkans, which is the well-known web platform on EU affairs and the Western, also the sponsor of this panel. And last but certainly not least, we have Jasna, who's the head of the Western Balkans Task Force at the European External and she's furthermore also a visiting professor at the College of Europe in Bruges in Belgium. And Florian, it would be great if you could give us a framing of the overall topic to unpack a bit all these issues that accompany the topic of anti-Western narratives in the Western Balkans. You've been writing on this topic from an academic perspective for so long. What is it, in your view, that makes this theme of the anti-Western narratives and of those non-Western countries in the Western Balkans so appealing? And what are the sources of such narratives? Florian, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thanks, Tena, for the introduction and also the question. It's a difficult one to answer, of course, in a few minutes, and I want to just point out a few things which I think are important. I mean, first of all, there's maybe a problem with the term anti-Western discourses or narratives, because what is anti-Western? I mean, this might have been a clear, identifiable position 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But for example, a lot of the anti-Western discourses, if we identify them such, are pro-Trump, for example. So are they anti-Western, or are they something else? So that's the first observation. Now, of course, there's nothing new to them. I mean, I started researching in the 90s, and in the 90s in Serbia, but also in other countries of the region, there was a lot of anti-Western discourse and lots of antagonism towards the West. And of course, this was then increased with NATO's engagement in the Yugoslav wars, in particular in Kosovo. So in that sense, there's nothing new about this. I think what happened in the 2000s was the sense of, well, there's no alternative to the European Union, to Euro-Atlantic integration. So this idea of the hegemony of the Western discourses, and also even the rhetoric of, there is no alternative to Europe, made it seem like this was the only game in town. And so in a certain way, it's maybe more exceptional that period of the 2000s, where that seemed to be the dominant and maybe hegemonic way of talking about it, than the reality we're today, where there's a competition of different views of interpreting the world, and no option is ever without alternatives. Maybe that was one of the weaknesses also in the way in which it was framed back then, to say, well, there's Europe and nothing else, Euro-Atlantic integration, nothing else. Of course there is, and there always will be, and it's a competition of ideas. So I think that's an important point. Why did it become so strong, maybe, or visible? Well, that's got a lot to do, I think, with the weakness of the European Union, the Euro-Atlantic project, rather than with the strength of the alternatives. So I think it's always a problem when there's a strong focus on the alternatives. Of course, we have to identify them, we have to identify the sources, and I'll come to it in a second. But I think we have to realize that the appeal and the traction has a lot to do with the weakness of the European, in a certain way, narrative, not just the project of enlargement and the kind of Euro-Atlantic kind of harmony between the EU and the United States, which have all suffered in recent years, but it's also about the kind of normative appeal and the appeal that it delivers a better quality of life for citizens. So the next point is, of course, what are the sources? And there's always a lot of attention on the external sources, be they big actors on the international scene, such as Russia or China. And of course, we can look there. And of course, I'm not denying the fact that there's sources of disinformation, that there are also sources of clear anti-Western narratives coming from both, particularly from Russia, I would say. But I would still argue that most of the sources are domestic. I mean, the main media outlets, the main narratives which are directed against the European Union and against the Euro-Atlantic project are domestic, and that's why they have traction. Russia or any external actor cannot create a new narrative out of the blue, but it often either kind of jumps on existing narratives, it amplifies them, it gives them space, but it doesn't create one where there wasn't one before. And so, in places which have a very strong kind of pro-Western narrative, in places like Kosovo or Albania, we don't see a fundamental shift because there isn't the kind of raw materials to make do with. So I think we have to look at more domestic narratives, and a lot of it got to do with the nature of governments and the nature of media publics in the region. And then the last point, because again it's just a short intervention, is that what I was kind of alluding to in the beginning is, what is anti-Western? I mean, Nigel Farage in Britain, or Marine Le Pen, or AfD in Germany, or Freedom Party in Austria are all, quote unquote Western parties or actors, but their narratives are what, if they resonate in the Balkans, we would call anti-Western. So I think we should maybe call them illiberal narratives, because they're not narratives which are not coming from the West, but they're often reinterpreting what the quote unquote West means. And maybe there isn't such a thing as the West anymore, but rather what we should talk about is a challenge to a liberal democratic understanding of politics. And there are dictatorships which are challenging this, and there are populists which are challenging these, and they often work together very well. And it is those who are the sources of these narratives, and they're undermining, of course, let's say, the Western the kind of ideas of what the West is, but that West is no longer because, the United States under Trump has been not a constructive actor, and has really been one which is an illiberal actor in terms of many policies, and so have many actors in Western Europe as well. So in that sense, I would say maybe we should rather call it the challenges to liberal democratic narratives. And those are illiberal, and of course they have it a lot easier because they just have to destroy one narrative. They don't have to offer a coherent alternative. I mean, it's in a certain way like the COVID deniers. You can deny it from the perspective of denying science. You can deny it on the basis of some marginal opinion within scholarship or medical profession. You can challenge it on the basis of crazy conspiracy theory. So you can group everybody together, from the people who believe that it's the reptile people who are governing the earth, to those who are just a little bit skeptical about established medical consensus. You don't have to offer an alternative. And this is, I think, one of the strengths, of course, is that it's not offering a different narrative, one singular one, but multiple ones, but all of them agree on their opposition to a liberal democratic narrative. And I think this is the real challenge. And the last point, and I'll conclude with that for my opening remarks, is also we have to be careful that sometimes this is also abused, because especially if we separate pro-Western and liberal democratic, then it can be used also by autocrats or by illiberal actors to say, well, I'm pro-Western. I might not be a Democrat, or a liberal Democrat, but I'm pro-Western. So the pro-Western part is more important than the liberal democratic part. And then, of course, this talk about anti-Western narratives can be also abused to actually stymie and reduce the space for an open debate. So one has to be also careful in a certain way of how this is employed and by whom.
Thank you very much, Florian, for this incredibly useful framing and helping us to go beyond this Western versus anti-Western and think it in broader terms of liberal versus illiberal, and helping us understand that sometimes what we usually conceive of as anti-Western narratives could be found within the West itself. So moving on to our second speaker, I would invite Asya, who's done some incredibly interesting research on various non-Western actors in the Western Balkans, to tell us a bit more about her research and to tell us about the ways in which the actions of China, Russia, of Turkey, and other actors differ in the Western Balkans, and in which way does she think that the main let's say tools in the box of these countries play out in the Western Balkans. Asya, over to you.
Good evening, everyone. I totally agree with Florian that it's kind of a simplification to talk about anti-Western narratives. It's more probably accurate to talk about competing narratives and competing agendas in the context of the Western Balkans. And I would like to point to the topic or the title of the Security Conference this year, No Trust, No Peace. Thinking of trust as a concept, I would like to stress the different layers of deficit of trust that, in my view, matter to the way how external actors project their power in the region. First, there is a lack of trust between citizens and local governments. Secondly, there is lack of trust between local governments and the EU due to the slow EU accession process. And finally, there is a deficit of trust between geopolitical actors competing in the region and have competing interests. These are China, the West, Russia, and Turkey, among others. So this lack of trust contributes to the way external actors project their power, and also the proxy actors that they've been choosing and they rely on to basically push their agendas. In other words, I would claim that external powers outsource their agendas to local actors. They build loose relationships with whether it's information actors, political or economic actors in the region, in order to present some kind of alternative. In all doing this, all powers basically use the vulnerabilities of the region, but in different ways. So while Russia and Turkey, I would argue, follow more top-down approach of narrative dissemination. And again, not necessarily anti-West, but the narratives that are basically their priority. China relies more on bottom-up construction narratives. In fact, local political and economic actors see themselves as incentivized to build a positive image of China in the region, hoping for investments, for long-term cooperation. And therefore, it is expected that the anti-Western narratives that we are talking about, they basically serve different purposes, different strategic purposes, and also they are pushed by different sets of proxy actors in the region. And I would like to go, let's say, to the empirics and say a few words for each of these external actors building influence in the region. First, Russia. Russia, as we know, integrates cultural diplomacy, relies very much on media campaigns with some elements of economic influence, with a specific focus on the energy sector. We talk about media coverage, we talk about security cooperation, and also NGOs, cultural organizations, academia, the church, and also a lot of nationalistic and patriotic movements in the recent years. In other words, Russia managed to build a network of proxy actors who are the voice of its interest in the region. It relies very much on Slavic Orthodox identity ties to the region and also exploits frozen conflicts. Turkey, on the other hand, actually there are a lot of similarities in this sense with Russia, that Turkey builds its influence in the region in more cultural and political manner, similar to Russia. However, there is no reliance on media campaigns in the same way. In this sense, the proxy voices or the proxy actors who share or push the agenda of Turkey are political actors, economic actors, religious organizations, and some of the local religious institutions as well. When we move to China, I would say that China exploits strictly economic gaps and economic vulnerabilities of the region without necessarily imposing specific political narratives. Yet we can say that it creates anti-West moods. Certainly, as I said in the beginning, China relies mostly on the top-down approach. The proxies I would identify are, again, governments, economic actors, but there is no space for cultural or religious influence. They don't rely that much on media, like in the case of Russia or Turkey. So the reliance of non-state actors is rather limited when we talk about China. And I would like to spend just final 30 seconds to the Gulf countries, who also have increased their influence in the region in the recent years. The voices are not that much institutionalized, but we talk more about bottom-up approach. The latest trend is that there is this, let's say, network of Salafi influencers or preachers who have been extremely popular on social media. And in their speeches, for example, I have identified these anti-West narratives that we talk about. These are, for example, rhetoric against the LGBT rights or gender equality, and generally all values offered by the modern society understood as modern in the West. I'm going to stop here, and I will be happy to continue this argument in the second intervention.
Thank you so much, Asya, for this fascinating overview. So, Nikola, we heard from Asya that external actors outsource their agenda to local actors. Would you agree with this definition? And can you give us some examples and some empirical insight into Serbia, which is the country you come from and on which you've done extensive research work? Over to you, Nikola.
Well, thank you, Tena. Well, I would say that a lot of attention from international community, international organizations who are dealing with fake news and disinformation is dedicated to the issue of foreign involvement in Serbia and other Western Balkan countries, where there is much research about, let's say, ownership or control over media, and about influence on the media, and about creating certain disinformation or anti-Western, anti-EU narratives. And I believe this is important, but maybe not as important as analyzing, as Florian rightfully put, let's say some internal or domestic political dynamics which lead to these narratives being particularly strong. Now, when you look at the entire Western Balkans, you would see that all the countries are dedicated, at least formally, to European integration. This is the goal for every and each one of them. But the support for this process differs greatly from country to country. And I'm going to just read some data here from the latest Balkan Barometer from the Regional Cooperation Council, which actually asks citizens of Western Balkan countries, or economies, as they put it, about when do they see that their country is going to become a member of the European Union, and whether they think that joining the European Union would be of benefit to their countries. And here we have some very interesting data. The average for the Western Balkans on the to the question whether membership is a good thing or a bad thing is 59% yes, 11% against. In Serbia, it is 26 to 24. So that means that Serbia is, let's say, more than 2 times below the average. And not only that, but the next country with the lowest support for, or maybe the country where citizens view membership favorably is Montenegro, where this is 54 to 14, which means that in Serbia it is more than 2 times less than in the next country when you look at the percentages of how people see membership in the EU. When asked about the question of whether they think that their countries are going to join the EU in the next 5 years, the average for the Western Balkans is that 28% thinks that they will join by 2025, and 26% that they will never join the EU. Of course, there are some answers in between. But in Serbia, it's drastically different. It's only 11% who think that their country is going to join the EU by 2025, and 46% who believe that their country will never join the European Union. So basically, just looking briefly at this data, you can see that in Serbia, there is quite a strong animosity towards the European Union. We know about NATO, of course, that the bombing campaign in 1999 contributed to this very strong animosity towards NATO in Serbia. But if you look at this data, you will see there is a strong amount of animosity against EU as well, despite, let's say, the support for EU membership. When people are asked the question, would they vote yes or no? I believe this is a different kind of question. And then you can, of course, ask yourself, why Serbia so specific? Is there something specific in Serbia's dynamics which leads to this narrative being prevalent in the society? And of course, one other thing which I wanted to mention is that the media, the print media with the largest circulation in Serbia, are perhaps those with the strongest anti-EU and anti-NATO narratives. According to Krieg investigative media, basically investigation from last year, these 4 media have published more than 400 fake news only on their front pages. And most of these news or the prevalent narratives of this media are pro-government, anti-opposition, pro-Russian, and anti-Western, by Western meaning against the EU, against NATO, and then of course also against neighboring countries and ethnic groups. Now, we have done this research together with Political Capital Institute from Budapest about the narratives linking Russia and the issue of Kosovo. And there are some very interesting patterns to be seen there. Basically all media, let's say most media in Serbia, whether they are mainstream media or fringe pro-Russian media, tend to view Russia quite favorably when it comes to Russia's role in dealing with the Kosovo issue. And there is basically one big difference between media on when they stand towards Russia. It is not whether Russia is the good guy, whether Russia is the key ally or not. It is about whether Russia is aligned with the Serbian government in protecting Kosovo and protecting Serbia's territorial integrity, or it is actually Russia who is defending Serbia even when the Serbian government does not. in the sense that in that narrative, basically the Serbian government is treacherous because it wants to recognize Kosovo, it wants to join the EU and maybe even NATO, and this is the main difference in narratives when it comes to how Serbian media basically see Russia. Maybe this kind of explains what do political elites in Serbia have to gain by promoting this specific, let's say, pro-Russian or anti-EU narrative. And this is exactly the point that Russia itself is quite popular in Serbia, and it is very important to portray to the voters of the ruling party and of course to the voters in the entire electorate that Russia is in fact aligned with the Serbian government and that the Serbian foreign policy is basically aligned with the Russian one on Serbia. Whereas those media who tend to criticize the government tend to show that Russia is defending Serbia, whereas the government does not. Maybe this explains why are the narratives sometimes, let's say, promoted, and how does it have to, what does it have to do with, let's say, domestic political concerns? This is a very important topic, I think, to be discussed.
Thank you so much, Nikola. So now finally coming to Jasna, who is able to give us a view from the European Union. So we heard that about these non-Western, anti-Western narratives. Do you think that they are actually able to damage the EU integration of Western Balkan countries? And if so, in which way? I'm really interested actually what happens in Brussels when Alexander Vučić in Serbia, for instance, makes a great show of friendship towards China and kisses the Chinese flag. How do you react? And do you think this is just a passing fad? Or is that going to have a serious consequence for the EU integration of Western Balkan countries? And second, we just heard from Nikola how media freedom is crucial in tackling these false narratives in some cases. Would you agree with that? And what are the actions that the European Union can do and is doing to counteract these problems? Over to you, Jasna. Thank you very much.
I got, I think, 4 or 5 questions in one. I'll try to unpack this. But I think what is really important when you act in foreign affairs is first to understand the motivations and interests. And the EU interests are very transparent and clear. The EU is there because the Western Balkans expressed joining the EU as a foreign policy strategy and a foreign policy priority #1. And we heard some of the opinion polls, and the numbers across the region are still very high. I mean, not across the entire region. There are areas rightly pointed out by our previous interlocutors when the numbers are lower, so the desire of the people to join the EU in some areas of the Western Balkans is still above 90%, which is the reason for the EU to be there and to have kind of the shared interest, because it is interest of the EU to have Europe whole and free, and is ready to support the Western Balkans aspirations. And when it comes to the other actors, of course, all other friends are welcomed, but it would be bad if some actions would obstruct this EU integration path, because, as you know, the European Union is founded as a union of democracies. So the whole process of accession is to facilitate democratic development of these countries. And all the money that the EU generously gives to the region is to help these social, economic, and political transformations that need to happen in the region. And in this context, these illiberal narratives, I like how Florian phrased it, are to be watched because not only in the Western Balkans, but everywhere they seem to try to undermine democracy. We see the attempts of interfering in the elections, undermining trust in the institutions, During COVID, it was very obvious that it was disinformation that was COVID related, tried to erode trust in medical authorities in given countries. So in that context, I think these illiberal narratives, I like the term, I'm going to continue using it, might obstruct Western Balkans' path towards the EU. It would be very, very important that the Western Balkan governments and civil society uses all of these opportunities to develop, first of all, to use the funding. I mean, and there was a lot of EU narratives, I would even say, not only in the Western Balkans but everywhere, where these operators were spreading EU lack of solidarity narrative, which is really wrong, because the facts were entirely different. I was in the Western Balkans at the time when the COVID peaked in the EU, and there were no registered cases at the time. So let me just kind of try to elaborate how these things seem to be working. And then, what I saw is that the EU member states practically in the 2 weeks in March follow the good advice that we get in an airplane. Put the oxygen mask on your face first. So, I mean, for example, and I really dig and found some data. On March 10, for example, Spain had 4,685 cases, and Serbia had 3, and North Macedonia had 2, and Albania had 4. And a week later, on March 18, Italy had 4,208 cases, and Spain had 9,066, and Serbia had 17, and Bosnia had 5, for example. And the first death case in the Western Balkans was on March 18. At that time, Italy had 476 cases per day. But the EU, even during that critical time for the EU, was really helping the Western Balkans, and I was able to see what is happening on the EU side and what is presented in the region via various actors or proxies, how they are called. I mean, the EU was working very, very hard for establishing joint EU-Western Balkans border crossings, so the food supply and the medical supply can go. The EU took care that the Western Balkans is added to the joint procurement scheme, so the Western Balkans can get medical equipment that is needed. At the peak of the crisis in the EU member states, putting the oxygen mask, which is really critical times, the EU worked with the regional organizations, Regional Cooperation Council, CEFTA, transport community, regional transport community, on establishing green lines. Team Europe mobilized, and then the EU, by its own standards, in 2 weeks, basically approved the release of 38 million euros of assistance, of emergency assistance to the region, followed by 374 million. And I saw massive efforts on the EU side, even in those critical times, because let's keep in mind, we are used to situations in which things are okay in the EU, and EU is there to help others in crisis. And the EU was helping China last year when China was dealing with the peak of the crisis. But this time, the EU was really in a very deep crisis. The situation in some member states was very, very critical, and the EU, I think, managed took 2 weeks to put the mask on its face in some of the EU member states, and generously help the Western Balkans. In some of the areas in the Western Balkans, this was well known and communicated. but in some others less so. And for me, personally, this is a good lesson to be learned, and to remind ourselves that this whole process of EU accession is about helping each other and having shared responsibility, and also shared responsibility for communicating. And even now, when we are talking about this new EU economic and investment plan for the Western Balkans, where we are talking about 9 billion euros until 2027, and additional grants and for up to 20 billion, it would be really important that this is also communicated to people in the Western Balkans. I mean, they know what the EU is, in a sense, because they still vote with their feet, and they're moving into the EU because they cannot. Many of them lost patience waiting for these transformations to happen in the Western Balkans. But as somebody who comes from the Western Balkans, my suggestion would be to use this generous support and develop these countries. It is understandable that other actors want to position themselves, but the region dominantly knows on which side the bread is buttered, and also it's not only about the money, it's about the set of values, because when we speak with the people and the groups from the Western Balkans, they do want these standards. They want functioning courts, they want good education, they want to live in democracy, they want human rights protected. And the last of the 4 questions that you, Tena, skillfully added to my pack, media freedom, absolutely essential. It has always been, and this is a critical. When we look at across the EU member states, the countries that manage to deal with info manipulation and disinformation successfully are those that have professional media, that have depoliticized public service broadcasters, that have good regulation of the media environment. And this is one of the key pillars, because disinformation and info manipulation and operators willing to manipulate information environment will always be there. What we can do is to create an environment in which people will build resilience to this manipulation. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Jasna. Thanks. So we've received some interesting questions from the audience, and I'll move on to that. So from Xavier, he asks whether the Russian, the Chinese, and Turkish agenda in the Western Balkans, whether they're compatible and whether they will keep being so in the long run. So in other words, do these external actors work together to a certain extent or not? And what is the focus for the future? So I would address this question to Asya, who's done research on all these actors. Asya, what are your thoughts on this matter?
As I said in the beginning of my intervention, I believe that these anti-Western narratives, as we call them, or anti-liberal, they serve different political agendas, which doesn't mean that the result at the end of the day is not basically a cooperation, even unspoken, between the different actors that are not the West. They certainly oppose the Western values to a certain extent. If we look, for example, at the religious tools or the cultural tools, or all these messages that appear from actors presenting as alternative to the West, I would say that there might be a certain sense of competing cooperation with the West. However, there is no indicator that this is the case on the ground. So there is no issue on which we can see, for example, a clear cooperation between, for example, China and Russia. There is like on the economic side, we can see a cooperation, for example, in the sector of energy between Turkey and Russia. But again, these are different packages of tools or different sectors where we can talk about cooperation. When it comes to the rhetoric, I wouldn't say that there is a certain thing. The long-term perspective, as we discussed, when we talk about agendas, there is a lot of politics, a lot of like strategic goals involved. Some of the actors in the region care about politics and they want to position themselves as regional or like geopolitical powers with more capacity to influence the political processes. And in this sense, I don't think that Russia is going away, that Russia is going to give up. I think that Russia now is stepping back a bit in the recent years, waiting for the US to see to what extent the US will continue its renewed interest in the region and to what extent the EU is going to get more actively involved with resolving issues like, for example, the dispute between Serbia and Kosovo. On the other hand, I would say that although I mentioned in my previous intervention that China has is exploiting strictly economic gaps, I would say that in the long term, this might have negative effects on politics of the region. Why so? Because we've heard of the so-called debt diplomacy, or let's say small countries becoming dependent on loans given by China. And in this sense, for example, Montenegro might be one of the examples for this. So in this sense, I think that in the long term, we are going to see the presence of external actors competing with the West more and more staying in the region.
Thanks, Asya. That's great. So, since you brought up Montenegro, I wanted to read out to you a headline that has appeared in a Western paper today. So, we've been speaking about newspapers in the Western Balkans, but the Western papers, I would argue, also have their fair share of propagating certain narratives. So today we had a headline on Montenegro that read, "Unholy Alliance, how Moscow turned to priests and bikers to topple Montenegro's rulers after failing with guns." So it's full on the malign power of Moscow that made a change of power happen in Montenegro, and of course no agency at all of the Montenegrin people. So I wanted to ask both Nikola and Florian what they think of that, and also to weave in another question from the audience, which is from Artan from Pristina, who asks to compare anti-Western narratives in Western societies with anti-Western narratives in the Western Balkans. In which way are they comparable and in which way they can be tackled, he asks. So, Florian, would you like to go first?
I mean, the headline you read is worse than I thought one would have. And I think that's the example of what I was giving at the end, is that there's also an abuse of the kind of argument of anti-Western, or the kind of the threat to the West is more important than maybe democracy at some point. So this is kind of this immoral, in a certain way, argument that if it's from Russia, if it has any kind of Russian support, or if that can be alleged, it's automatically bad. And if it's pro-European, pro-Western, it must be good. And I think that's, of course, a big problem. And in Montenegro, we've seen that, where it shows you the ambiguity. So this does not downplay the fact that there is Russian influence when it comes to parts of the opposition, and that interest is certainly not always in the sense of a liberal democracy. But that does not, first of all, that is a very kind of downplaying the problem on the other side, that first of all the government is rather authoritarian for a long time, entrenched, kind of competitive authoritarian system in Montenegro. And of course, it also undermines the argument that there's a much more pluralistic position in the opposition. So yes, it is. That's exactly the problem. That's why I think illiberal is better than anti-Western as a way to frame it. And so I think it's in this direction we should rather focus our debates.
Lovely, Nikola.
Yes.
Do you have any comments on that?
I mentioned already how the Serbian government kind of plays on the pro-Russian card, trying to present itself as pro-Russian to win some votes and support. I think the other way around is also possible. A government can play the Russian card by appearing to be under threat from Russia. And therefore, I definitely believe that in Montenegro we have seen exactly this, where Russia is seen as the boogeyman and as basically a constant threat, whereas we can turn a blind eye to some other problems because the Russian threat is there and the government was obviously against Russia and pretty much turned towards integrating into NATO and of course the European Union. So I believe that this is quite possible and basically plays into the argument which I mentioned before. It is that these domestic political concerns are maybe a more important source of these narratives than these external actors themselves, which of course have some of their own interest, they have some of their own influence, but I believe that domestic concerns and political dynamics, internal political dynamics, are the key to understand where it comes from.
Thank you, Nikola. So we had another question from the audience for Jasna. Igor Mirosavljevic asks, can the EU's reaction to the COVID-19 pandemic, which was criticized by politicians and by part of the public in the Western Balkans, fuel anti-Western narratives in the region? And if so, what can the EU do to prevent this? Now, Jasna has already partially addressed that, but do you think that there is a real risk that after this pandemic, the EU's image will take a hit or not? And I also wanted to ask you, I know that you worked on some really interesting public diplomacy projects from the ground, on the ground in the Balkans that gave some interesting results. And I wanted to ask you how you think that working at a school level and on topics relating to education can help us address these problems. Jasna, over to you.
Regarding the question, I mean, I already explained the facts. And I know that there is an impression in parts of the region where the anti-EU and a lot of criticism against the EU has been pushed. But that was also pushed via certain channels within the EU, and that was a global operation. Again, this is why I believe that this anti-democratic and illiberal argument sticks, because this was, in general, COVID was used as an opportunity to undermine democracy and to show that democracies are not capable of dealing with the crisis. And that narrative was strongly pushed in different parts of the world, also within the EU, but in many EU member states it didn't get much traction. And I think, as some of the colleagues mentioned, that those narratives echoed stronger in some parts of the Western Balkans where there were domestic message multipliers or media outlets that wanted to push that narrative forward and create that perception. I'm underlining the word perception because when we read the opinion polls after the COVID and the first, I mean, the crisis is still going on, after the first peak of the crisis, done by some of our international partners, not us, all of them found that the numbers of support for the EU are still very high, and that in many parts of the Western Balkans, people appreciated highly the support that they received, and they were able to see it and they were able to hear about it. So we are talking about the narrower areas, so not too broad brush is to be used on this perception and creation, and where this narrative was pushed strongly. The research of our international partners says that the EU managed to defend its narrative when you look at the numbers. But I understand that in certain parts of the Western Balkans, impression still is that the EU failed in dealing with the crisis and all of it. And this is simply not accurate, and I already hinted at some of the facts how strongly the EU. I was there and able to see with my very own eyes how strongly EU prioritized the Western Balkans and gave it a privileged access to everything when it was really dealing with an unprecedented crisis within its own borders. So that really, but what would help is really having local media scenes and local influencers, sort of both on government and non-government sides, really passing those messages. That would really help, because the EU alone cannot compensate for the lack of communication via domestic channels. Public diplomacy, I firmly believe in public diplomacy as a way of supporting the implementation of the foreign policy objectives. That's really something that is massively important in the EU-Western Balkans relations. I think the EU has to rely on public diplomacy in the Western Balkans, and the Western Balkans needs to rely on public diplomacy within the EU and the EU member states in order for this process to succeed. I prefer public diplomacy rather than PR, let alone PR stunts or propaganda, God forbid, because public diplomacy relies on genuine dialogue and on genuine engagement abroad in explaining certain foreign policy issues. So I think it's very, very much needed, considering what's happening because as you know, not all member states are very enthusiastic about enlargement, and I think good public diplomacy would be needed to build a reputation of the Western Balkans partners within the EU as a future reliable and as a credible candidates and future good member states. And I love public diplomacy as an activity rather than these others that I mentioned, because in order to look good abroad, you need to be good. You need to adopt good policies, you need to implement them, and then that picture is then accurately portrayed abroad. And this is something that would benefit in the relations. And of course, the EU would be happy to support Western Balkans governments and civil society in updating the image of the Western Balkans within the EU, but at the same time seeks partnership and support on accurately informing about the EU within the Western Balkans. It's a two-way street.
Thank you, Jasna. Thank you. We need to move on because we are now coming to the end of the panel.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to read the very last question from the audience, which is from Asya, and says, Asya, is it not a bit too easy to stereotypically just to blame externals for this anti-Western narrative in the Western Balkans? Should we not also consider the endogenous forces instead of just looking at the exogenous ones? So I find this question quite ironic because it somehow proves the point made at the beginning that whatever you do, whatever you say about this topic, you'll be damned because you will receive criticism from all sides, in spite of the fact that I think everybody in this panel has addressed this issue of the endogenous forces as well. Now I would ask then Asya to give us some quick on how she sees this, and then I will ask immediately afterwards Nikola and Florian, who had some less time, to give us their concluding remarks, and we will finish there. So Asya, you can go, the floor is yours.
I think that we all agreed today in the panel that we talk about basically localization of external agendas. We talk about the role of the local proxy actors, whether it's about local media actors, politicians, economic actors who basically adopt and multiply agendas of external actors with interest in the region. So in this sense, there is no doubt that blaming external actors is not the right approach. And I believe that looking at the localization of these narratives is what makes sense. The question that I believe remains somehow unanswered in many studies already is how the EU and how the West can fill the gap that the local governments feel more appealing and more attractive to cooperate with investors or with foreign powers who don't condition their investments and their support. As we know, to receive investments or to receive certain support from the EU and Western institutions, there should be some reforms, some rule of law, some following some values. Whereas other external powers don't have these expectations, and this is why they become more attractive and more appealing to local governments. The question is how to change this, or how to address this in order to basically make more space for the EU integration and the future integration of the region in the West.
Thank you, Asya. Nikola, very quickly, 1 minute. Over to you.
Competing narratives is a problem in itself. I believe that there should be different narratives, both for the sake of a democracy in a particular society and for the sake of EU integration. We don't really have to all blindly follow this one particular narrative and be all in favor of EU or NATO integration to achieve this goal. But I believe that we have a serious problem with propaganda. And this is not a narrative which is created naturally. This is an agenda somebody has to push certain messages or to support certain political processes. And I believe this is quite a danger, I would say, in the Western Balkans, but more specifically Serbia, where at the same time when we are negotiating for EU membership and we have very close relations with NATO, it is here still a common insult to tell somebody that he's a Western spy or traitor just because he's in favor of EU integration. And if you have certain political elites who basically push these messages, if you have media who just basically feed on that for years, then in the end you are going to have completely a polluted atmosphere where it is impossible to rationally advocate for European integration and then maybe face some opponents of this process. And media freedom in that regard, as you rightfully mentioned, is very important. We need to have media freedom if we are going to have also an open and honest discussion about these processes as well.
Thank you, Nikola. Florian, the concluding words are yours. In 30 seconds, what do you think are the main things to keep in mind from this panel and from this discussion?
I think what I want to say is, first of all, that you need to have actors in the region who are actually committed to the liberal agenda. And we have these narratives prevailing because they are not genuinely committed to either the Western agenda of European or Euro-Atlantic integration or of the idea of liberal democracy. So I think that makes it make the region more susceptible. And the other issue, I think, is institutions, whether it's media or other institutions which are able to in a certain way defend those values and also help to take away the magic from these fake narratives or these other narratives which are illiberal, essentially, because they are thriving in an environment of kind of confusion, weak institutions, and that is, I think, why they are able to have a certain amount of traction.
Thank you so much, Florian. Thank you, Jasna. Thank you, Asya. Thank you, Nikola. And thank you to all the fantastic audience and for the very interesting questions that reached us. I will conclude the panel now and wish you a very good viewing of the next panel of the Belgrade Security Forum. Have a good evening, everybody.